Good to be back to another prayer service. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Randy, would you lead us in prayer, please?
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunity here again on Wednesday night. Praise your name. Just lift it up, Lord. I pray for everyone here tonight, Lord, that they have a burden of need, that you meet that need. Lord, we continue to pray for the people in Texas, those children that chemo coming in and out, rest on the parents, Lord, pray you be with them. Just be with us tonight, Lord. May we not forget the blessings that you give us. We praise your name tonight.
Number 362, Rescue the Perishing. 362. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying, snatch them in pity from sin and the grave. Weep o'er the erring one, lift up the fallen, tell them of Jesus the mighty to save. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying, Jesus is merciful, Jesus will save. Though they are slighting him, still he is waiting, waiting the penitent child to receive. Plead with them earnestly, plead with them gently, he will forgive if they only believe. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying, Jesus is merciful, Jesus will save. Down in the human heart, crushed by the tempter, feelings lie buried that grace can restore. Touched by a loving heart, wakened by kindness, chords that are broken will vibrate once more. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying, Jesus is merciful, Jesus will save. Rescue the perishing, duty demands it, strength for thy labor the Lord will provide. Back to the narrow way, patiently wend them, tell the poor wanderer a Savior has died. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying, Jesus is merciful, Jesus will save. All right, turn over to number 674, When We See Christ. 674. Ofttimes the day seems long, our trials are to bear. We're tempted to complain, to murmur and despair. But Christ will soon appear to catch his bride away. All tears forever over in God's eternal day. It will be worth it all when we see Jesus. Life's trials will seem so small when we see Christ. One glimpse of his dear face, all sorrow will erase. So bravely run the race till we glimpse of his dear face, all sorrow will erase. So bravely run the race till we see Christ. Life's day will soon be o'er. We'll cross the great divide to glory safe at last. We'll share the joys of heaven, a harp, a home, a crown. The tempter will be banished. We'll lay burden down. It will be worth it all when we see Jesus. Life's trials will seem so small when we see Christ. One glimpse of his dear face, all sorrow will erase. So bravely run the race till we see Christ. Who would have a prayer request? We'll stand and sing the first, second, and last verses. Stand, please. If the word from you withhold of its silver and its gold, and you have to get along with meager fare, just remember in his word how he feeds the little bird. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. Leave it there, leave it there. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. If you trust and never doubt, he will surely bring you out. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. If your body suffers pain and your health you can't regain, and your soul is almost sinking in despair, Jesus knows the pain you feel. He can save and he can heal. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. Leave it there, leave it there. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. If you trust and never doubt, He will surely bring you out. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. When your youthful days are gone and old age is stealing on, and your body bends beneath the weight of care, He will never leave you then. He'll go with you to the end. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. Leave it there. Leave it there. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. If you trust and never doubt, He will surely bring you out. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. Let's remain standing for prayer. Frank, would you lead us in prayer, please?
Good evening. This evening we'll be in Hebrews 12, first 3 verses. Looked at this passage a few times, maybe look at it with fresh eyes this evening and share some fresh thoughts, even though Psalmist said there's nothing new under the sun, but maybe there's some things that we'll see that we've not seen. But the writer of Hebrews, many believe was Paul, but we're not certain. But he writes there in chapter 12, "Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest you be wearied and faint in your minds." In this chapter, the writer expands on what he had written in chapter 11. When you see the wherefore or therefore, it's reflecting back on what has just been said, and he expands on the implications of chapter 11 on our own lives as you think about the power of faith in the life of a believer and what individuals were able to accomplish because of that faith. Hebrews 11, it's a pretty lengthy chapter, but I'd encourage you to go back and read it. The picture of chapter 11 is of a race that the believer is required to run, and the reference is doubtless being in regard to the foot race of the Grecian Games that the recipients of this letter would have been very familiar with. And as we think about the Christian race, you go back to verse 1 of chapter 11, and it says, "For faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." And when you think about the race, think about the race of faith and the journey of faith, that these many individuals that the writer elaborates on their accomplishments because of faith and how that applies maybe to each of us. But there are different points in the analogy that we find there in chapter 11 when you think about this race and the truths that maybe are intended to be taught by this word picture that the writer uses all throughout chapter 11. First of all, the life of faith is a difficult struggle. A lot of the individuals that are mentioned there, Abraham and others, they really were struggling against circumstances, and their faith was not an easy faith, yet they believed. Peter writes in 1 Peter 4:18, "The righteous is with difficulty saved." There's difficulty, there's hardships, there's challenges in the Christian walk. In the Christian calling, the race that we're called to, it's not a casual stroll, but it's a race, and it demands strenuous effort. It demands exhausting effort. So it's a difficult struggle, but then also it's a struggle which demands committed focus. It is set before us. There's a goal that's to be kept in view, something that we're to remain focused on with our hearts and our minds and our energies. There's a prize to be won, and as a result, there's a mapped out path of faith and obedience, of the duties that, as believers, that we are called upon to pursue. And then it's a struggle that requires perseverance. The believer must run with patience. The individual can't allow his commitment to fade, his dedication to fade, or his focus to fade. We can't rest until we finish the course that's set before us. And then it's a struggle which will soon be over. Scripture says, "Yet a very little while." And one day the Christian, each of us, will have reached our goal, and we would have won the prize, and that's Jesus himself. But then also this race is a public spectacle. It's a public activity. The writer there in verse 1 of our reading this evening, "We're compassed about with a great cloud of witnesses." Obviously, we know that we run this race under the eye of God himself. And as we live our lives, really we're, if you would, as believers, we're performing for an audience of one. There really doesn't matter who else is watching as long as we please him. But others are watching as well. It's believed that the angels are watching. It's believed that one place said the spirits of just men made perfect. Our fellow believers here, they're watching. The ungodly, the unsaved, those who are outside of the household of faith in the world around us, they are watching. So as we think about running a race and being found faithful, like all those listed in chapter 11, there are conditions of successful running. My brother Jeff, he ran track, he played tennis, baseball, basketball. He was the athletic one. Larry played football, which explains a lot. He played in the day of leather helmets, so I'm just going to leave that alone. He was on the undefeated football team at Mount Logan Junior High in the 9th grade. They went undefeated. And his picture was in the trophy case, and they were all wearing their little leather, they looked like the old leather helmets, no face mask. And my brother's the evidence of what happens when you take too many blows to the head. But and I can say that because I know he don't have internet. But there are conditions of successful running. And the writer here of Hebrews, as you look at chapter 12, verse 1, we're also compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and run with patience the race that is set before us. There's been a push from the 50s onward to make football equipment as light and aerodynamic, if you would, as possible, to make it as light and encumbering so that it wouldn't be a burden to the athlete to be able to run and to affect his agility. And with the lightness, often there was the downside of less protection, but they've really done well in creating helmets that aren't excessively heavy and shoulder pads that are made out of some of the lightest yet most durable material. All that was for a reason, to make the runner faster, to not burden them down and wear them out with excess weight of running on the field and carrying more than what they had to. And as you think about what the writer is saying here, there are some things that the believer needs to do to lighten his load, to make him more effective, to make him more agile, to make him more able to endure. And when you look at to lay aside the weights, this word represents anything that would become a disadvantage in running, whether it be pure or not. This is amoral. It has nothing to do with sin or with depravity or anything else. It's obviously every evil passion is a weight. Every sin, every sinful attitude or act, anything that we hold to, it's going to be a weight and it's going to hinder the believer's run. But even those things that are lawful to the believer can become a heavy load if we abuse it. Through inordinate affection, getting our values and our loves out of order, of not keeping Christ primary and Him being our first love, and allowing other things that are noble, things that are good, to maybe compromise that first love that we have for Him. We can pervert a good gift of God into a dead weight and something that will hold us back and pull us down. And some habit that's no hindrance at all to Josh or to Randy, it might be something that I have to deal with. And all of our responses to the burdens and the weights that we carry are different. But then there's also weights of prosperity, weights of care and sorrow, the weight of worldly, what's the word I'm looking for, like worldly business or the things of this world that can just overwhelm us and demand more of our time than what we should give it. Earthly ambition, even human affection. One commentator put it this way: the things which are seen must not be allowed to lie heavy on the soul if we would successfully run the Christian race. So anything that weights us down, anything that becomes a hindrance to our testimony or to us actively and passionately pursuing Christ, can be a weight. But then the writer says, but also the sin which doth so easily beset us. Now, sin really is the primary burden. It's the biggest issue that we have to deal with in this life. And the writer said it easily besets us. Now, that word beset, it's not really a word that we use a lot. I don't know that I've ever used it except maybe reading this passage. But Strong's Exhaustive Concordance talks about what beset means. It means it cleaves to us. It wraps itself around us like a cloak. It clings to us as a parasitical plant would to a tree. It doesn't sound healthy. It doesn't sound good. So when we have sin in our lives that is wrapping itself around us and literally maybe even strangling the life out of us, it's a problem. And we also have to keep in mind, this isn't written to worldly folk, this is written to the church. It's sin in general that the apostle characterizes as being something that easily besets us. Now, in the original, the adjective doesn't refer to particular sins, whatever they might be, whatever we're most prone to. But I think that application would certainly fit here. The writer probably had the sin of apostasy in mind because he was writing to Hebrew Christians that were considering, and many had already started the process of drifting back to Judaism and falling away from the living God, is the way that the writer of Hebrews puts it, I think, over in chapter 3. I'm going to have, I think it's 3:12. Yes. Take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief and departing from the living God. And the concern was they're drifting back to Judaism. And this sin and every other sin has to be laid aside. If we don't renounce sin, we're ultimately going to forfeit the race. So there's some encouragements to persevere in our running. In the midst of affliction, fatigue, as well as a temptation at times maybe to go back to the old life, and some people have done that. As we deal with that kind of stuff, how are we going to be revived? How are we going to be encouraged? How are we going to overcome? I think there are two motivators that are given here in our reading, and one is there in verse 1. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. Now, we've looked at this before. The word witness there, it can be taken two different ways. It can be taken as someone who is watching on, like a spectator would be watching a sporting event. Or it could be taken as a witness on a stand, in the witness stand in a court of law, one who has experienced and can testify to their experience. The Old Testament saints, obviously, that are mentioned in chapter 11, are these witnesses, and they're witnesses of a race that they once ran themselves. They can testify to the race. They can testify to the hardship, to the challenges, but they can also testify to the faith that they placed in God and how that faith was something that He rewarded and how that they overcame because of the faith that they had placed in Christ and in God, and God saw them through. But they also are seen as those who are cheering us on, if you would. Not only they testify to the power of faith, they can also be spectators of our struggles and conflicts and all those who have come after them. Now, as the writer writes, his language is more than just, if you would, poetic license. He seems to say that the spirits of just men made perfect are very aware of what's being done here, of what's going on in our lives, and they're interested in it. Obviously, I can't confirm that. It's just a faith issue, but some who know the language better maybe have a better idea of how it speaks to that. But I do have some good commentaries. So the pulpit commentary says, we are to think of them as hovering over us in the heavens. They circle and crowd around us, tier upon tier, on both sides of the race course. On the one side is the gallery of the saints before the flood, that of the Hebrew pilgrim fathers, of the heroes of the Exodus, of the judges, and of the prophets, while on the other side is the gallery of the apostles, those of the Christian confessors and martyrs, of the missionaries of the church, and of our own departed friends who have gone to glory. These spectators are a great cloud, a multitudinous in number. They are radiant with the brightness of immortality, and having themselves passed through the same experience as we, they keenly sympathize with us. We should therefore take heart as we hear their heavenly greetings and realize the fellowship with us which they claim. So, the first thing that should encourage us is knowing that there are witnesses. If none else, it's God Himself. The Trinity is cheering us on. But then also, the example of Jesus that the writer gives us in verses 2 and 3. And when you see what the writer has to say, looking unto Jesus, the author, the word there literally has to do with being a leader, being the beginner, the implementer. Obviously, he did write the plan of salvation, but this is more in regard to Jesus as being the leader or the implementer of our faith. But he says the author and finisher. And that word finisher is literally the word perfecter. So he perfected the faith. And while we're very aware, and even gratefully aware maybe, of the presence of whatever witnesses there are, we're to fix our focus on Him and Him alone. The writer refers to Jesus here in His human nature as being our pattern and example. His presence is the greatest in all the list of the heroes. If you go back through chapter 11, there's no name that tops the name of Jesus, who is the author and finisher of our faith. And there's none other listed in Hebrews 11 that compares with Him. And the picture that the writer of Hebrews paints for us through these words, it's arranged in two categories. We see Christ on the one side in His humiliation, but then we see Him on the other in His exaltation. And the word picture is this: Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Now that word author, it's captain, prince, head, leader of all those in the faith. His faith that He displayed during His own earthly life is an absolutely perfect example of trusting God. By faith, He waited at Nazareth with His life's mission really kind of stirring in His heart during these 30 years. By faith, He assumed the burden of the world's sin. By faith, He conquered Satan in the wilderness. By faith, He completed the labors of His 3 years of active ministry and His mentoring of the disciples. By faith, He endured the agonies of Gethsemane. Jesus didn't shrink back despite all the unique temptations that Satan put before Him. And then, by faith, He accomplished the greatest of all tasks by purchasing our pardon on Calvary. So He is also the finisher or perfecter of our faith, because in Him, faith had its perfect work. There is no one else who has ever lived, no one who ever will live, that can equal Him as an example of faith. He's our model. He's a great model. The early Hebrew Christians were to consider Him. Paul wrote, and the very cross that became a stumbling block to them, He endured it. And if they were being treated as apostates of Judaism, if they were being treated poorly by their neighbors and by sinners, Jesus was even more so. Their sufferings and their temptations weren't nearly as terrible as His. So seeing then that Jesus, for the sake of the eternal reward that was awaiting Him, the writer says, He preserved to the end and running the race that was set before Him. Why should any of us, why should any of His followers grow weary, fainting in our souls, as we read there in verse 3? It was His endurance of the cross that gave him his place at the right hand of God. And we're told that all who follow him in the race of faith will eventually sit with him upon the throne. So 3 things in closing, then I'm anxious to hear what you all might have to add or to share. Life and death depends upon whether or not we run the Christian race. Secondly, Christ will give us strength to run well if we just ask him. And thirdly, he will crown us at the end. And it's more than the crown that Paul referred to in 2 Timothy 4. I think the real prize is when Jesus bestows himself upon us. And he embraces us. And we hear those words, well done. That's the lesson. I'm anxious to hear what you all might have to share.